Priya Anand had exactly one rule about her phone after a glass of wine on a Thursday night. And the rule was simple. Nothing gets sent after 10 o'clock. Because nothing good has ever come from a decision made after 10 o'clock on a Thursday. She broke the rule at 10:47 p.m. Standing in her bathroom in a slip of dark red silk she'd bought for an anniversary that had ended 6 months ago in a breakup she still wasn't entirely over. Taking a photo, she'd meant, with the particular defiant confidence of a woman trying to convince herself she was fine, to send to Marcus, the ex in question. Because nothing said "look what you gave up" quite like a well-lit mirror selfie, sent at the worst possible hour. She scrolled her contacts with the specific carelessness of someone whose thumb had learned her phone's layout by muscle memory rather than actual attention. Tapped the name that sat 2 rows above where Marcus's name used to be before she deleted, and rebuilt her contact list twice trying to get over him, and hit send with the satisfied finality of a woman delivering a very specific kind of message to a very specific kind of person. It was only afterward, lying in bed scrolling through unrelated messages with the particular emptiness that always followed doing something she half regretted, that she noticed the delivery receipt attached to a name that was decidedly not Marcus. Damien Cole. Read 10:48 p.m. Priya sat up so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. Damien Cole was not her ex-boyfriend. Damien Cole was the CEO of Coleridge Analytics, the company she'd worked at for the past 2 years as a senior data strategist, a man she had spoken to directly perhaps 4 times in the entirety of her employment. All of them in conference rooms. All of them entirely professional. All of them involving absolutely nothing that could be described, by any reasonable definition, as personal. His contact had ended up in her phone months ago after a project handoff required his direct line, saved under a formal D. Coleridge, that her thumb, apparently in a moment of wine-soaked autopilot, had confused for an ex-boyfriend 2 contacts away in an alphabetized nightmare she had never once cleaned up. She had sent a photograph never intended for professional consumption to the single most powerful person in her professional life. And he had read it within 60 seconds of receiving it. Priya spent the next 4 hours in a state of low grade, spiraling panic that no amount of pacing, water drinking, or frantic Googling of "can you unsend a read message" managed to resolve. Because the answer, infuriatingly, was no. You could not. And the message sat there, delivered and read. A small glowing monument to the single worst decision she had made in years. She drafted 17 different follow-up texts and deleted every one of them. Because there was no version of that wasn't meant for you. Please pretend this never happened. That didn't sound exactly as mortifying written down as it felt to actually consider sending. She called her best friend Rima at midnight, fully aware of how insane it was to be waking someone up over a misdirected photograph, and got exactly the reaction she deserved. "You sent what to who?" Rima said, her voice cracking with a laughter she was clearly trying, and failing, to suppress out of some baseline loyalty to Priya's suffering. "The actual CEO. Damien Cole. The man whose face is on the company's annual report. This isn't funny, Rima. It is a little funny. It's extremely funny, actually, and I'm sorry. But I need you to understand that in 6 months this is going to be the best story either of us has ever told at a dinner party." Rima's laughter softened, eventually, into something more useful, walking Priya through the actual, practical question at hand, rather than the spiral of catastrophizing she'd worked herself into. "Okay. Realistically, what's the worst that happens? He's uncomfortable. Maybe HR gets involved. Maybe you have an awkward meeting. You don't lose your job over an accidental text, especially not one you can clearly explain as a mistake. You don't know that. I know you're an excellent employee who has never once given that company a reason to want you gone, and I know most reasonable adults have sent at least one text to the wrong person in their lives. Go to sleep. Deal with it in the morning like an adult, not at 1 a.m. like someone building a doomsday scenario. By 3 a.m, she had convinced herself she would simply resign in the morning, cite a family emergency, and move to a city where Damien Cole had never heard her name. By 6, exhausted and entirely out of options, she had talked herself down from resignation and settled, instead, on a strategy of showing up to work exactly as she always did and hoping, with the desperate optimism of the truly cornered, that some merciful universe might simply let the whole thing dissolve into silence. The universe did not cooperate. At 9:14 a.m., an email arrived in her inbox from D. Cole, subject line blank, body consisting of a single line, "My office, whenever you're able. No rush." Priya sat frozen at her desk for a full 2 minutes, phone in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, running through every possible version of the conversation that email could be opening. She settled her nerves as best she could, smoothed down a blazer that suddenly felt entirely inadequate to the occasion, and walked the length of the office toward the corner suite, with the particular calm of a woman marching directly toward her own execution. Damien Cole's office was exactly as intimidating as she remembered from the 4 previous occasions she'd been inside it. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. A desk clear of everything except a single laptop and a framed photograph she'd never been close enough to actually see the subject of. Bookshelves lined with the kind of leather-bound editions that suggested either genuine reading or a decorator with excellent taste. And Damien himself, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, dressed with the effortless precision of a man who had never once had to think about what effortless precision cost. She had always found the office slightly intimidating in the abstract way that success generally was, but standing in the doorway now, phone practically burning a hole in her bag, the intimidation had curdled into something far more specific and personal than it had ever been during a routine strategy review. "Close the door," he said, without turning around, and Priya's stomach dropped through the floor. She closed it, and stood there, and waited for the ground to open beneath her. And instead, after a long moment, Damien turned around with an expression that was not, in fact, the icy professional fury she'd braced for. It was something closer to barely restrained amusement, the corner of his mouth doing something complicated it clearly wasn't supposed to be doing in a formal HR context. "I want to start," he said, "by acknowledging that whatever you're currently imagining this conversation is going to be, it is almost certainly worse in your head than what I'm actually about to say." "I can explain," Priya said, the words tumbling out before she'd fully decided to say them. "It was a mistake. A contact mix-up. It was never meant for you, and I understand if this changes things professionally, and I'm prepared to discuss whatever arrangement makes you most comfortable, up to and including my resignation, though I'd obviously prefer Priya." He said her name the way he said everything, evenly, without hurry, and it stopped her mid-sentence more effectively than anything else could have. "Nobody's resigning. I called you in here because I think we should discuss it like 2 adults, rather than let it sit between us unspoken for the next 6 months of quarterly meetings. That's very generous of you, given the circumstances. It's not generosity. It's practicality." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and Priya sat, mostly because standing had stopped feeling like a viable option. "I deleted it, for what it's worth, the moment I realized it wasn't meant for me. I want you to know that. I'm not in the habit of keeping things that don't belong to me." "Thank you," Priya said, with a rush of relief that made her voice come out smaller than she intended. "I genuinely don't know how it happened. I was texting an ex, and your contact must have been saved right next to his, and I wasn't paying nearly enough attention, and I am so deeply sorry." "You don't owe me an apology for a mistake," Damien said, and something in his expression shifted, the careful, professional composure giving way, briefly, to something more considered. "Though I'll admit, since we're being honest with each other this morning, that deleting it took slightly longer than it should have." Priya blinked. "I'm sorry? I said I deleted it. I didn't say I did it immediately." He held her gaze with a directness that made her suddenly, acutely aware of the office's silence. The closed door. The two of them alone in a room that had, in the space of one sentence, stopped feeling remotely like a disciplinary meeting. "I'm telling you that because I think you deserve honesty, given what an uncomfortable morning I've clearly put you through. And because I've spent the better part of a year being scrupulously professional about the fact that I find you considerably more interesting than any of the strategy decks you've presented in this office. And last night made that considerably harder to keep pretending I don't notice." Priya stared at him, several competing responses colliding in her head at once, none of them coherent enough to actually voice. "You're my boss, I'm aware. You're the CEO of the company I work for. Also aware, and considerably more aware than you are, I suspect, of exactly how many HR complications a sentence like the one I just said could generate. Which is precisely why I haven't said anything like it before this morning, and might not have said it at all if last night hadn't happened. So this is my fault. I didn't say that." A trace of real amusement broke through now, softening the careful formality he'd been holding since she'd walked in. "I said last night made it harder to keep pretending, not that it obligated either of us to do anything about it. I called you in here to clear the air about an accidental text, not to complicate your professional life further by making a declaration you didn't ask for. I'd understand entirely if you'd rather we simply agree never to speak of any of this again." Priya sat with that for a long moment, watching him watch her, aware of her own pulse in a way she hadn't been in months, since well before the breakup that had prompted last night's disastrous decision in the first place. "And if I didn't want to agree to that?" Something shifted in Damien's expression, careful and deliberate, like a man recalculating odds he'd assumed were settled. "Then I'd suggest we handle it the way I handle everything else that matters to me. Carefully and without cutting corners, and with considerably more attention than either of us gave a certain contact list last night. That's a very corporate way of asking someone to dinner. I own 3 companies, and a considerable amount of my personality is calcified around spreadsheets. I'm working with what I have." The admission came with a wry, unguarded honesty that did something unfair to Priya's composure, the same composure she'd spent all morning trying, and failing, to hold together. "Dinner, Priya, nothing more complicated than that, unless you'd like it to become more complicated. Which I'll leave entirely up to you." "People will talk," Priya said, though it came out considerably less like an objection than she'd intended. "People already talk. I imagine several of them are talking right now, given how long you've been in my office with the door closed." He said it without concern, the easy dismissal of a man who had long ago stopped organizing his life around what people speculated about in break rooms. "I'm not asking you to manage a rumor. I'm asking whether you'd like to have dinner with me on Friday, entirely separate from anything either of us does for this company during business hours." Priya considered the question with more seriousness than she'd expected to bring to it, given that 4 hours earlier she'd been convinced this conversation would end in unemployment, rather than an invitation. "I'll need to think about it. Take all the time you need." He returned to his desk, sitting down with the same measured composure he'd carried since she walked in, though something in the set of his shoulders had loosened, almost imperceptibly, the particular relief of a man who had said something he'd been holding on to far longer than one accidental text message. "For what it's worth, whatever you decide, Nothing changes about your position here. You're excellent at your job, and I'd rather lose the chance at dinner than make you feel this conversation came with strings attached to your paycheck." "That's a fair way to put it," Priya said, standing, feeling considerably steadier than she had walking in, though her heart was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with professional relief. "I'll let you know by Wednesday." Wednesday works. She made it as far as the door before she turned back, unable to resist the question that had been building under the surface of the entire conversation. For the record, the photo. Was it at least a good one? Damien looked up from his laptop with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting, with considerable restraint, for exactly this question. "I deleted it before I let myself form an opinion. I'm a professional, Priya. You just spent 10 minutes admitting you're not, in this particular case." "A momentary lapse," he said, and there was that unguarded, almost smile again, the one she suspected very few people in this building had ever been allowed to see. "I promise you my aim, going forward, is to be considerably less lapse-prone. Starting Friday, if you'll let me." Priya left his office with her heart considerably louder in her own ears than it had any right to be for a Thursday morning, and spent the rest of the day fielding curious glances from coworkers who had indeed clocked the length of her closed-door meeting and were now constructing theories ranging from termination to promotion, none of which came remotely close to the truth. She held out until Tuesday evening before she texted him back, this time with considerably more attention paid to the recipient field than she'd managed the previous Thursday. "Friday works. Somewhere that isn't within walking distance of the office, preferably, given how thoroughly this building already gossips about us." His reply arrived within the minute. "Already reserved a table somewhere considerably more discreet. I had a feeling you'd say yes eventually. I've learned to plan ahead of the people I find interesting." "You had a feeling," Priya typed back, "or you simply refused to consider the alternative?" "Both," Damien replied. "I find it's usually more efficient to assume the outcome I want and work backward from there. It served me reasonably well in business. I saw no reason to change strategies now." Priya set her phone down on the counter, standing in the same bathroom where the entire, mortifying, improbable chain of events had started 4 days earlier, and found herself laughing at the sheer ridiculous shape her week had taken. A wine-soaked mistake, a closed office door. A man who ran 3 companies admitting, of all things, that a single wrong number had rearranged something he'd spent a year keeping carefully in order. She deleted Marcus's contact entirely that night, moved Damien's to the top of her favorites without a second thought, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel considerably more curious about what came next than afraid of it.